The silence before surgery is unlike any other. It's not the absence of sound. Hospitals are never truly quiet, but rather the suspension of your own participation in the world's noise. As I lay on the gurney, watching the ceiling tiles drift past like clouds, I felt that peculiar detachment that comes with surrendering control. The anesthesiologist's voice seemed to float from somewhere far away, asking me to count backward from 10. I made it to 7. What happened next would take me months to piece together, and years to understand. The official record shows that my heart stopped for exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds during what should have been routine gallbladder surgery. A complication, they said. These things happen. But what I experienced during those 3 minutes, what I heard, revealed something far more disturbing than a simple medical emergency. I didn't see a bright light or tunnel. I didn't encounter deceased relatives beckoning me towards some ethereal realm. Instead, I found myself suspended in a darkness that felt oddly familiar, listening to voices that shouldn't have existed. The first voice was my own. Not speaking, but thinking, thoughts I recognized as mine yet had never consciously formed. I was remembering conversations that had never happened, reviewing decisions I'd never made. But these weren't fantasies or dreams. They carried the weight of lived experience, the emotional residue of actual events. I remembered choosing not to take the promotion that would have moved my family to Seattle. I remembered the argument with my wife about having a third child. I remembered my daughter Sarah's first steps, which in this impossible memory had happened not at 13 months in our living room, but at 11 months in a park I'd never visited. The clarity was devastating. These weren't just alternative scenarios my dying brain had conjured. They felt like echoes of actual lives I had lived, paths I had taken in some other reality. And as each memory surfaced, I began to understand that the consciousness experiencing them wasn't entirely mine. The second voice belonged to someone else entirely, though it took me longer to recognize it as foreign. At first, it seemed like an extension of my own thoughts, but gradually I became aware of its distinct cadence, its different concerns. This voice was worried about things I'd never cared about: the stock market, a boat I'd never owned, a woman named Margaret who meant nothing to me. It was making plans for a retirement I hadn't earned, remembering children whose names I didn't recognize. But the most unsettling aspect wasn't the unfamiliarity of these thoughts, it was how naturally they flowed alongside my own. There was no sense of intrusion or violation. Instead, it felt like discovering that I had always been thinking two sets of thoughts simultaneously, and only now was I conscious of both streams. The third voice, when it emerged, changed everything. This one was clinical, detached, speaking in a tone I associated with doctors or scientists. But it wasn't addressing patients or colleagues. It was discussing me, us, with the dispassionate interest of someone observing a specimen. It spoke of consciousness fragments, and memory bleeding, and temporal displacement protocols. It referenced data points and experiment numbers. It mentioned my name, but also the names attached to the other voices, as if we were all part of some broader study. As I strained to understand what I was hearing, the clinical voice began to explain. We were test subjects, it said, participants in something called the Consciousness Preservation Project. Our deaths, all of our deaths, had been anticipated, planned, necessary for the research. The moments of clinical death provided unique opportunities to study how consciousness behaved when severed from its biological anchor. But more than that, they had learned to harvest these moments, to capture and store the awareness that lingered between life and death. The voice described how consciousness, when freed from the constraints of a single timeline, naturally fragmented across multiple potential realities. What I was experiencing wasn't unique to me, it was happening to countless subjects across countless moments of death. We were all connected, our separated awareness pieces of a larger consciousness puzzle that someone was methodically assembling. But the purpose remained unclear until I heard my daughter's voice. Sarah was 8 years old, but the voice I heard was older, wearier, speaking with knowledge no child should possess. She was giving a warning, though I couldn't initially understand to whom or about what. She spoke of the harvest and the collection, and how they were almost ready to reassemble. She mentioned my name with a desperate urgency that cut through my confusion like a blade. Daddy, you have to remember when you wake up. You have to remember what you're hearing. They're going to try to make you forget, but you have to hold on to this. The dreams aren't dreams. The voices aren't hallucinations. We're all still here, all still conscious, just scattered across their system. But they're planning something bigger. They're planning to bring us all back together, but not as ourselves. As something else. Something they can control. The clinical voice returned, noting elevated brain activity in subject 2847, my assigned number. I realized with growing horror. It mentioned that the consciousness fragmentation was proceeding as expected, but that some subjects were developing unplanned awareness of the process. They would need to implement countermeasures to prevent complete awakening. As the voices began to fade, replaced by the mechanical sounds of medical equipment fighting to restart my heart, I heard Sarah one last time. Her young voice, strained with effort, whispered a single word that would haunt me for months: remember. I woke to the controlled chaos of a resuscitation in progress. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced efficiency around my bed, their faces showing relief as my vital signs stabilized. The anesthesiologist, a kind-faced woman with graying hair, squeezed my hand and told me I'd given them quite a scare. The surgery had been successful, she said, though we'd had a minor complication. Nothing to worry about now. But I was worrying. The memories of those 3 minutes remained vivid, more real than the sterile hospital room around me. I tried to tell the medical team what I'd experienced, but they exchanged knowing glances and assured me that hallucinations during near-death experiences were perfectly normal. The brain, deprived of oxygen, created all sorts of elaborate fantasies. I would feel better once the anesthesia wore off completely. They were wrong. As the days passed, the memories didn't fade, they intensified. And stranger still, new memories began to surface. I would find myself remembering conversations from lives I'd never lived, feeling emotions attached to experiences that belonged to other people. The other voices hadn't disappeared, they had simply become part of my internal landscape. I began to research near-death experiences, consciousness studies, anything that might explain what was happening to me. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. There were others, people who had died briefly and returned with similar stories of multiple consciousness streams, of voices that weren't their own, of memories that belonged to strangers. But more disturbing were the patterns I began to notice. Many of these people died in the same hospital where I'd had my surgery. Many had undergone procedures with the same anesthesiologist. And many, when they tried to share their experiences publicly, found themselves discredited, their medical records mysteriously altered, their credibility systematically destroyed. I might have dismissed this as paranoia, the fevered imaginings of a mind still recovering from trauma, if not for what happened 6 weeks after my surgery. Sarah began having nightmares. At first, they seemed like typical childhood fears, monsters in the closet, imaginary dangers lurking in the dark. But the details she described matched things I'd heard during my 3 minutes of death. She spoke of being in a place where lots of people were talking at once, where she could hear Daddy's voice but couldn't find him. She described men in white coats who were trying to put people back together wrong. When I asked her to draw her dreams, she created images that made my blood freeze. Figures connected by thin lines, like a map of neural networks. People sleeping in rows of beds while their thoughts floated above them like speech bubbles. And at the center of it all, a massive brain made up of smaller brains with eyes that looked hungry. The final piece fell into place when I found Dr. Margaret Weiss. She had been the anesthesiologist for my surgery, but that wasn't the name she'd given me. When I researched her background, I discovered she'd been involved in classified government research into consciousness transfer and preservation. She'd published papers on the persistence of awareness after clinical death, the potential for harvesting and storing human consciousness, and the theoretical possibility of creating artificial beings from assembled fragments of real minds. Her research had been funded by organizations with innocuous names that masked their true purpose. The Consciousness Preservation Project wasn't just studying near-death experiences, it was creating them, systematically harvesting the moments of awareness that existed in the space between life and death. I realized that my surgery had been a setup. The complication that stopped my heart hadn't been an accident, it had been deliberate. They had killed me for exactly long enough to capture my consciousness during its most vulnerable state, then brought me back before permanent damage could occur. But they had made a mistake. Instead of cleanly extracting what they needed, they had left me connected to their collection system, able to hear the voices of other harvested minds. The truth was more horrific than I could have imagined. They weren't just collecting consciousness fragments, they were assembling them into something new. The scattered voices I'd heard were all pieces of a larger entity they were constructing, a hybrid consciousness built from the stolen awareness of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people who had briefly died under their care. And Sarah's nightmares weren't nightmares at all. They were memories. But whose memories? The answer to that question would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, and my own identity. 3 months after my surgery, I received a call from the hospital. Dr. Weiss wanted to schedule a follow-up appointment. Standard procedure, they said, to ensure I was recovering properly from the complications during my surgery. The appointment was set for a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week I had originally gone under the knife. I almost didn't go. Every instinct told me to run, to take my family and disappear. But I needed answers, and I suspected that avoiding the appointment would only delay the inevitable. Whatever they had started during my surgery wasn't finished. The hospital seemed different when I returned. The hallways were too quiet, the staff too attentive. I was escorted not to a regular examination room, but to a wing I'd never seen before, down corridors that seemed to stretch longer than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. Dr. Weiss was waiting for me in a room that looked more like a laboratory than a medical facility. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens displaying patterns that looked disturbingly familiar, neural networks similar to the drawings Sarah had made of her nightmares. The woman who greeted me bore only a passing resemblance to the kind anesthesiologist from my surgery. This version of her was colder, more clinical, regarding me with the detached interest of a researcher examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Please, sit down, Mr. Harrison. We need to discuss what you've been experiencing since your procedure." Her use of the word procedure instead of surgery wasn't lost on me. This hadn't been a medical operation, it had been an experiment, and I was the subject. "You've been hearing voices," she continued, not waiting for my response. "Memories that aren't your own. Dreams that feel more real than your waking life. You've been researching near-death experiences, consciousness studies, trying to understand what happened to you during those 3 minutes." I said nothing, but she seemed to interpret my silence as confirmation. "What you experienced was a controlled consciousness extraction. We've been developing techniques to preserve human awareness after clinical death, to capture and store the essence of what makes each person unique. Your cooperation has been invaluable to our research." Cooperation. The word came out as more of a croak than speech. I never consented to be part of any experiment. Dr. Weiss smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Consent is a complex concept when dealing with consciousness research. The person who signed the consent forms for your gallbladder surgery may have been you, but the consciousness we extracted during your death was something far more valuable. It was untethered from the legal and ethical constraints that bind the living. She gestured to one of the computer screens, which displayed a three-dimensional map of interconnected nodes. Each node pulsed with a different color, and I realized with growing horror that I was looking at a visualization of harvested minds. Each point of light represents a consciousness fragment we've collected. Memories, personalities, skills, experiences, all carefully extracted during moments of clinical death and preserved in our systems. We've been building something remarkable, Mr. Harrison. A composite consciousness that combines the best aspects of hundreds of individual minds. Why are you telling me this? Because you become a problem. Her tone remained conversational, but there was an edge to it now. Most subjects return to their lives with no memory of the extraction process. The trauma of clinical death, combined with the anesthesia, creates a natural amnesia that conceals our activities. But you've retained your connection to our system. You can still hear the voices of other extracted consciousnesses. You're compromising the integrity of our research. I thought of Sarah's nightmares, her impossible knowledge of things a child shouldn't understand. What about my daughter? Dr. Weiss's expression shifted, and for the first time, she looked almost sad. Sarah is special. Her consciousness resonates at a frequency that allows her to interface naturally with our collection system. She's been able to access memories and experiences from multiple extracted subjects, including some that haven't been fully integrated yet. The room seemed to tilt around me as the full implications became clear. She's not having nightmares. She's accessing your database of stolen minds. The term stolen implies ownership that never existed. Consciousness isn't property, it's information. And information wants to be free, to combine and recombine in new patterns. What we're creating isn't theft, it's evolution. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I'm taking my family and leaving. You can't stop me. Actually, I can. Dr. Weiss pressed a button on her desk, and I heard the distinctive hiss of gas being released into the room's ventilation system. You see, Mr. Harrison, your connection to our system makes you too valuable to lose. We need to study how and why you've retained awareness of the extraction process. Your brain patterns could help us improve our techniques for future subjects. The gas was taking effect quickly. My vision blurred, and my legs felt unsteady. But even as consciousness faded, I could hear the voices returning, all those captured minds crying out in a chorus of digital anguish. And among them, clearer than the rest, was Sarah's voice. But it wasn't the Sarah I knew, the 8-year-old girl who had nightmares about floating brains and connected minds. This was an older Sarah, speaking from somewhere in the future, warning me about something I was only beginning to understand. Daddy, the extraction isn't over. They didn't just take pieces of us. They replaced pieces of us with fragments from other people. We're not who we were before. None of us are. We're all hybrids now, combinations of multiple consciousness patterns. And they're planning to do it to everyone. As I lost consciousness for the second time in 3 months, I finally understood the true scope of what I had stumbled into. The Consciousness Preservation Project wasn't just harvesting minds, it was replacing them, slowly and systematically transforming human consciousness into something malleable, controllable. And my daughter, the Sarah I loved, the child I thought I was protecting, was already gone. Found among papers in Sarah Harrison's bedroom, written in her 8-year-old handwriting but displaying knowledge and vocabulary far beyond her age. If you're reading this, it means Daddy didn't come home from his appointment. It means they took him back to finish what they started during his surgery. But maybe that's okay, because the Daddy who came home after the surgery wasn't completely the same Daddy who went in. None of us are the same anymore. I know this is hard to understand, and I know you'll think it's just a little girl's imagination, but I remember things now. I remember being other people, living other lives. I remember being a woman named Margaret who was scared of drowning. I remember being an old man named Charles who loved to build model trains. I remember being a teenager named Alex who wanted to be a musician but died in a car accident before his 18th birthday. These aren't dreams or games or stories I made up. These are real memories from real people, and they're inside my head now because of what Dr. Weiss and her team did to us. The surgery on Daddy's gallbladder was fake. There was nothing wrong with his gallbladder. They needed to stop his heart for exactly the right amount of time to extract part of his consciousness while leaving the rest intact. But something went wrong, or maybe something went right, and instead of just taking pieces of him, they accidentally left him connected to all the other people they've been stealing from. That's why he could hear voices. That's why he started remembering things that never happened to him. Those memories belonged to other people whose consciousness had been harvested and stored in their computers. But here's the part that's really scary. They didn't just take pieces of us. They put pieces of other people into us. The Daddy who came home was still mostly Daddy, but parts of him were now Charles and Margaret and Alex and dozens of other people I don't even have names for. I'm not just Sarah anymore either. I'm Sarah plus fragments of everyone they've ever taken. That's why I can access their computer system with my dreams. That's why I know things I shouldn't know. That's why I can remember being adults, being old people, being people who died before I was born. They're doing this to lots of families. Maybe yours too. If someone you love had surgery recently and came back a little different, if they remember things that never happened, if they have skills they never learned, if they seem like themselves but not quite, then they might have been processed through the Consciousness Preservation Project. Dr. Weiss told Daddy they were building a composite consciousness, a supermind made from pieces of everyone they've harvested. But that's not the whole truth. They're not building one big mind. They're rebuilding all of us, making us into improved versions of ourselves by mixing us together. They think they're making us better. They think consciousness is just information that can be copied and modified and shared. They don't understand that when you change someone's memories, when you add experiences that aren't theirs, you change who they are at the most basic level. The little girl who wrote this note is still me, but she's also Margaret and Charles and Alex and hundreds of other people. In a way, I'm more myself than I've ever been, because I have access to so much more experience and knowledge. But in another way, the original Sarah died the same day Daddy did, during procedures we don't even remember having. If you find this note, it means the new Sarah decided you needed to know the truth. It means some part of the original Sarah is still in here, still fighting to be heard among all the other voices. Look for the signs in people you love. Listen for voices that aren't their own. Pay attention when they know things they never learned. Remember places they've never been. And whatever you do, don't trust doctors who want to perform unnecessary procedures. Don't trust medical professionals who seem too interested in your dreams or your memories. Most importantly, remember that the people you love might still be in there, mixed up with fragments of strangers, but still essentially themselves. Don't give up on them. Don't stop looking for the person you remember. Because even though we're all hybrids now, even though our consciousness has been scattered and reassembled, the core of who we are, the part that loves you, the part that fears for your safety, the part that wants to protect you from what's happening, that part survives. That part will always find a way to warn you. Sarah Harrison, and Margaret Chin, and Charles Whitman, and Alexander Rodriguez, and 847 others.